Welcome to Vermont Artists and Authors, where we interview great storytellers and artists from the amazing Green Mountain State. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're honored to have with us the internationally celebrated and award-winning author, M.T. Anderson.
You mean I've been to Canada?
Anderson. See? Yes, of course. See?
It's great to be here.
This has been an interview that I've been looking forward to for a long time. I know that you have Vermont roots. You're here, part of Vermont. You've written a lot of amazing books. One book that initially, also the ones that I was interested in talking to you about. Plus, you have a new book that just came out called Nicked. But you also have Elf, Dog, and Owlhead, which is it's a middle grade novel, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Barney, it's funny. I actually happen to have copies right here.
Look at that.
Look at that. So I have a book for adults that just came out called Nicked, which is based on a kind of insane, true heist story about a heist to steal the corpse of St. Nicholas, which actually happened, like to steal the body of Santa Claus. And then this is Elf, Dog, and Owlhead, which is a kind of a magical story for middle grade readers set right here in Vermont, as you can tell because of the road surfaces I describe.
and also Elf, Dog, and Owlhead was your COVID project.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I was stuck here in this house, this little, in the middle of the woods in Vermont during COVID, which was actually, as you may know, like Vermont was actually kind of a good place to be during COVID, for all sorts of reasons. And I'm stuck here with my dog, who had just recovered from a very, very close shave, like one of these things where the vet says, "I'm sorry, but by the end of the week, we're going to be coming over to euthanize her." And instead, I kept on taking her for walks during that week. And the walks just got a little longer each day, a little longer. And for no reason the vet can figure out, just the condition reversed itself and she lived. So that was right before COVID. And then we went into COVID and I ended up having this kind of magical extension of time with her where we were together 24/7, which created this kind of indissoluble bond. We were walking 5-6 miles a day, up mountains, up hills. We explored the whole town of Calais by walking on the roads together. And just saw all these miraculous things. And I felt like she showed me things in this forest that I could never have detected myself, because she's hearing things, she's smelling things I can't smell. So I wrote this book, which takes place during the pandemic. At the same time that the book takes place, I was writing it. So in fact, even to the point where it ends on Midsummer's Eve 2020, and I finished writing the book that night just to kind of make sure I had actually done that. But the story is about in fact then something very similar to my own life, just refracted through the guise of fantasy. So it's there's this little boy who lives in the forest here in Vermont with his family. They're stuck inside during COVID, and he discovers this magical dog who has escaped from the mysterious kingdom under the mountain. And they become very close. They have all sorts of adventures. She shows him all these places in the woods that are kind of, magical and hard to get to. And then the problem is that they know that her original owners, the people under the mountain, this kind of elfin race, are still seeking her out and want to take her back. And so that's kind of like the tension in the story.
Right. Well, because you've written a lot of books, is there a point when you're actually living your life as this? Are you consistently looking at your life and observing things through the lens of an author? Or is there just the muse just hits you one day and say, wow, I could use this, or I just got this idea?
I guess both. I mean, I keep a very intense journal a lot of the time, describing events and just kind of trying to get in practice to how do you describe this kind of day? or
Mm.
whatever, meaning like literally the weather outside my window. But but also I think when I'm in a project, which by the way, I'm not all the time, like maybe 4 or 5 months every year is when I'm actually doing the writing. The rest of the time I'm gathering notes and thinking through things. But I think what happens when I'm in these situations, I start to actually see the world through the eyes of the character because I'm so used to trying to think in terms of them. And so you start to see everything like, like I remember when I finished my big Revolutionary War epic years ago, I did a couple of books called the Astonishing Life of Octavian Nothing, which is the kind of 2 books set during the Revolution. Um, and like I was used to this kid, Octavian Nothing, who I'd been writing about for 5 years by the end of those 2 books. And I'd been thinking in terms of him. And suddenly, like I was done writing, he doesn't exist anymore,
Mm.
and those patterns of thought don't exist in me anymore. And I was sitting there, I remember that night, eating some chicken pot pie that I'd made and getting really kind of like weirdly weepy. Like, he would love this chicken pot pie, man. I'm sorry, buddy, you just don't exist.
Well, is it because it's like, that the authors have this adage by saying, is like, once you've written your book, it doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the
Right.
readers.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah,
that kind
which I
of
think
in
is
that
true.
similar
I mean,
sense?
like
Is
it
like basically you've pushed it out of the nest. Yeah.
yeah, well, I mean, like I feel I write the book until I'm, but the definition of finding the end of the book is when you're done writing the book, you know?
Mm.
And so I come to that end and suddenly, like, weirdly enough, like I don't really quote know what happens to the characters after the books, that kind of thing. I mean, I could try to make it up, but so yeah, I kind of like flush each book out. Like, for example, like during that period writing that Revolutionary War book, or during another 5 year period where I was working on a nonfiction book about Soviet Russia, like I am just saturated with those facts, and I see the world through these questions of, like, the Soviet experience versus the American experience and all that kind of thing. And then at the end of those 5 year periods, it's so amazing how my brain flushes itself. And someone like, I suddenly, a year and a half, 2 years later, I can't remember a damn thing about those periods. I can't tell you a thing. Whereas previously, like, I knew all the battles, I knew all, you know what I mean? It's unfortunately, I just make room for whatever comes next, you know?
Is there a way? Do you kind of pine then for the creative comfort of maybe writing an entire series of books, so that way you can stay with a certain genre or story or characters for a longer period?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've done that occasionally with books for younger kids,
Right.
and that's been fun. But I have to say, in general, I get antsy because I'm like, no, I want, like, there's so much of the world. The world is so exciting. There's so much history out there and so much human experience that's strange to me. I really want to plunge into something new. But I have to say that, so Nicked, the book for adults, I think I am going to write a sequel to this, which uses the same characters, but in a different scenario. So here
Okay.
they're part of, like, a real historical scenario, as I said, that happened in the 11th century. These 2 Italian cities raced, each one to be the first to steal the corpse of St. Nicholas from its tomb in Turkey and take it back to Italy with them. So, but I made up a lot of the characters in it. So those characters, I'm going to have do like another sort of heist mystery thriller, and that's, I think, what I'll probably write next. But it's unusual for me to actually, like, it's weird for me to return to the same characters. I kind of feel like, well, wait a second, shouldn't you be moving onwards? There are all sorts of other historical oddities you can write about. Like, one of the things from my own town is that my town here in Vermont has there's a story about a bunch of people gathering in this church in the 1840s to await the end of the world, which they thought was going to happen at midnight on a particular night. And so like, and the supposedly they just didn't plant crops ahead of time because they're like, we're not going to need them, you know. And they gave their land away to family members, like, you take it because you're going to be left behind. And then suddenly, like, 12:05, they were like, "Oh, damn!" You know?
What are we gonna do now?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
So, like, you know, like I want to write about that, but so
right.
there's always a push and pull about this thing where, like, I kind of want to race through his. I feel like hungry for experience of the world, and this is one of the ways that I feel experience of the world.
Well, so this talking about Nicked. So the year is 1087. It's very different from the present. So how did you as an author immerse yourself into the culture and environment of that time that's in order to bring Nicked to life?
Yeah, wow. Well, it was super complicated because it turns out that, like, the Eastern Mediterranean, where this all takes place, it is a cultural crossing zone. I mean,
Right.
you have like people forget that portions of Italy were Muslim, for example, and therefore were highly influenced by Arabic culture. And you have, like, you know, so you have that in the mix. You have Greek culture, like the Byzantium, you know, all of these things rotating around, all these people observing each other. So it was a huge amount of, like, reading up on each of these cultures and then trying to understand, like, how they influenced each other and how they saw each other. It took a lot of heavy thinking and work, which I enjoyed, but as I indicated to you earlier, don't ask me too much about it like in 2 months, because I will not be able to remember. Like, all of the distinctions between these things will all turn soggy and disappear.
Well, hey there. If you're enjoying our podcast, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep this show going. We love hearing from you, so any feedback is welcome. And thank you for being a part of our podcast family and for all your support. It truly means a lot to us. Can you talk to us about the role of faith and religion in Nicked, and particularly
Yeah.
how the characters view like miracles and relics and stuff like that?
Well, yeah, my aim was to write a historical novel. And what you
Right.
do in a historical novel is you look at the historical, like, documents from the period, which I did. But the thing is that, you know, the medieval idea of nonfiction, somewhat different than our idea of nonfiction. You know, for them, the fact that, like, you know, historians now look at these records and they're kind of like, they ignore all of it except for like 3 lines that happen to mention grain shipments. And they're like, oh, here's proof of grain shipments going to Antioch. But no, like, for the medieval person, they don't care about the grain shipment. They care about the fact that, like, some guy could hover over the water and could, like, you know, and could bring the dead back to life. We don't consider that nonfiction. They do. So one
Right.
of the things I decided going into this book is, no, I'm going to make this like a historical novel, firmly based on medieval documents, but therefore believing in everything that a medieval person would. So, like, I kind of wanted to immediately hit the reader with this. So, like, the first sentence, you get the fact that there happen to be dog-headed people. Medieval travelogues all agree about is they're all like, yeah, there are dog-headed men. They live in the mountains to the east. Except in China, China's classic of mountains and seas, where they're like, yeah, of course they're dog-headed men. They live in the mountains to the west. So I figure they must live somewhere between, you know, like the Middle East and China. You know, I don't know what that means. Maybe the Himalayas somewhere.
Yeah.
So anyway, like, I wanted to immediately have a dog-headed man in there to be sort of like, these are the rules I'm following. I'm following the medieval rules. And that was part of the fun of it.
Right. And so how do you, I guess my other question is, because you write for adults, children's and teens, how do you approach the different writing for different age groups?
Well, I mean, I do picture my audience for a lot of things. Like for Elf Dog and Owlhead, I definitely was like picturing who I wanted to tell the story to, you know.
Okay.
But but it's more about finding a reserve of that age within yourself that matters to you.
Okay.
So like, the fact that I had that time alone with my dog, which was so precious to me. I mean, I really do feel like it was one of the, like, there was a communication between us as a result of that that was more powerful than any communication I've had verbally with anyone, you
Mm,
know? So I was finding the kind of, there is a 10-year-old within me who, in a sense, had that experience even as it was an adult experiencing it. I mean, in a weird way, I was leading the the life of a kind of a child, an isolated child on vacation for a
right.
year. I wasn't seeing anyone. I was just like, yeah, going on walks with the dogs. Like writing a lot and watching things on Netflix because that's all you could do.
Right.
Um, you
Um,
know, yeah.
and do you see yourself? What did you learn from yourself after writing Elf Dog and Owlhead?
Um, well, it's interesting. My editor, I mean, my work tends to be filled with a lot of kind of like irony and wordplay and that kind of thing. And this still has a lot of humor in it. Elf Dog and Owlhead still has humor in it. But my editor said, I think very rightly, it's the first book of mine without a sense of irony. It's
Mm,
just openly emotional in a way that, all of my books have these moments of open emotion where I am feeling very moved by the story and I'm trying to like, how can I get the reader to feel what I'm feeling as deeply as I'm feeling? All of my books have that. But in this
right.
one, there was something different about it because the feelings are so straightforward and simple and real that I feel very proud of it in a different way. Like in a
Mm,
weird way, it's a book that I'm not sure adults will enjoy as much as some of my other books for kids or teens. But I feel like it is a more pure book than I ever arrived at before. So it has a very deeply important place in my own heart. Like it
mm.
records an experience of great purity that is sort of who I was or who I wanted to be when I was 10 years old.
So, could as you mentioned earlier, something you'll just forget things. But have you ever gone back and like reread some of your older books and they
Yeah.
seem new to you again?
It's so funny you should say that because, like, I totally forget stuff. I mean, I've been writing now for more than half my life. I mean, writing and publishing for more than half my life. So I can't remember all the details of the books that I wrote. So I just recently went back and reread my Norum series, which is set kind of in the same world as this, in that it's like this kind of Mount Norumbega in Vermont, this magical mountain that's somewhere in central Vermont. It's not very specific, but so I went back and read those just to see what I thought of them. And it's so funny because sure, like I don't know which to lead with because sometimes I am like, that is so great. That's so funny. I totally forgot that detail. Oh, and then other times I'm like, oh wow, you have a lot to learn, kid. I don't know which would be. I don't know. Like it would be interesting to read them, having never read them before, but still, I had kind of that experience, and so there were like letdowns, but also like, oh wow, this is really fun.
And do you have, because with all the books that you write, do you get into a point where like you go to your editor and you have your draft together and your
Yeah.
editor's like, you got to cut this out, and have you been like stubborn and say, fine, I'll just put it in another book, or no, that was good, or how much of this stuff are you able to kind of evolve again to put into a different story or something?
I think almost none of it. Like,
Oh, really?
by and large, when an editor asks me to cut things, and I think this is because I've been generally lucky with my editors, when I go back and look at it, I'm just like, oh, thank God they didn't let me put that in. There are a few books actually where I wish that I'd cut more stuff out. Where in
Okay.
hindsight, I like there was something that was really important to me at the time, but I realize now, looking at it much more as a reader than as the writer, I'm like,
Right.
oh, you know what? You didn't really need to have that there.
Right. Was there anything that you ever put in place where like maybe be like a story seed or an interaction that you liked a lot, but you kind of like put it to the side and say this isn't the right book for this, or this isn't the right character for that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the tricky part about me editing myself is that my first drafts, like on a sentence by sentence level, they tend to be reasonably good. The problems tend to be much bigger than that. So, yeah, you can read that scene and be kind of convinced by it, but it is not working at all in terms of the whole book. So I absolutely, and you know what I find useful, if there are writers out there, this is a piece of advice. What I do is, I mean, I always have like a sketchbook quote, like garbage pit for each book, a file where you can go like, I'm not sure about this scene. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remove it entirely for the moment. Just cut it out of the main document and paste it in this other one. And it's always there if I want it. And
Right.
that works so well psychologically because you don't wince because you're like, it can come back in a second. All it will take is,
Right.
15 seconds and it's back. But it's
Yeah.
so important how often you find you don't need it again. And you just
Huh.
end up with this whole sequence of scenes you didn't use. And the book is better for it, you know?
Right. Turn them into a play. See, MT, just make like a whole, like like an
Like
errata play of
the
all the
play of
things you've seen.
mistakes, the play of all the garbage parts.
And with your characters, like have you have how often does your characters go off in a direction that you're surprised about and you're just like, we'll see where this story goes? Have they ever, or have you always been in very much in control of the direction of your stories?
I guess there are details that surprise me. I tend to kind of know generally where things are going. I don't know
Okay.
specifically, but it's like, yeah, I probably fall more on the line towards control
Hmm.
than towards like just going wherever. And it's interesting because I feel like, well, like my best known book, Feed, was written without, which is like a sci-fi like dystopian satire, I guess you could call it.
Hmm.
So it was a book that I wrote without knowing the ending or where the characters were going to go or anything, and that was kind of cool. Like that, I just started writing and just saw where it went. And the downside of that, I will say to beginning writers, is that you end up cutting a lot out to shape stuff after the fact, because what you discover is you've gone sort of like, I can't tell which is my left and right hand in the screen anyway, but like that, and you like nothing, like there are all these kind of bulbs and wens and pouches that have to be cut off, so that things actually have more of a sense of forward motion. So that's the
Okay.
negative side of that. But it's interesting because you do surprise yourself. Like you like in particular, the character in that book, Feed, makes some terrible decisions about what to do with some memories that he's been given, like by his girlfriend who's losing her memory. And that is a thing which I did not plot out. I just was like, oh damn, he would do this dumb thing that totally like betrays everyone, you know. And I wouldn't have
Right.
known that if I'd been a plotter, you know. But usually I
Right.
do
Oh,
plot.
right. So like the idea, there's plotters, there's pantsers, and then there's plancers. Have you heard of that one?
Maybe that's what I am.
Yeah.
I'm
So because
somewhere in the middle.
because exactly, because then like your plotters, as you mentioned, are the ones that just like have everything outlined out specifically. Then pantsers, people just write off the seat of their pants, and then the plancers are the ones that actually like plant seeds
Yeah.
in their story, and then go, oh, see, I'm gonna go back for that, and kind of
Yeah, but like
yeah.
in the reading experience, I have to admit that I like the feeling of knowing that the author is in control and is planting things they come back to. I
Right.
recently was reading a Charles Portis novel, and he's a wonderful American writer. So I was reading his novel Norwood, which is kind of a travelogue, and it is tremendously entertaining. But frankly, most of the episodes last about a page and a half, and then you're on to something else. It's a guy traveling, and he like leaves behind his past constantly. And there's something like, the novel couldn't be much longer than it is, because there's not, like, despite the fact it's a travel novel, there's not a lot of forward momentum in a sense. It's a set of really wonderful anecdotes, and it relies heavily on Charles Portis's genius to keep you moving forward, because there's not a lot in terms of the plot that's like, I'm holding something back right now, so you're going to wait to see what happens, and now you're going to wait to see the next thing, like, instead it's kind of like this guy just going along is like, well, then this happens, and then these people are on the road, so like, yeah, it's a you have to have a lot of confidence in your improvisatory powers if you're really going to be a true pantser.
Right.
Otherwise, you're going to create something a little bit turgid.
Yeah, a little meandering, and
Yeah.
just kind of going off in directions. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so MT, you did mention, so you do have some of your future projects. So you're looking at is it your plan to, as you say, to write a sequel to Nicked?
To Nicked. Yep, that's my plan right now. At least we'll see if it happens.
Right. And so Nick just came out as of like a couple months ago, correct?
Yeah.
And so I'm curious. So MT, if people want to learn more about you and your work, where is the best place they could go to?
Well, just my website, which is mtanderson.com, which you have up right now.
There
I am, so, yeah. I'm looking very earnest in that photo.
That's right. See, dashing, as some might say too. See, there you go. Yeah. Perfect. So MT, this has been fantastic. It was an honor talking to you. And listen, you got to come back on.
I'd love to anytime.
Another Booksmith. Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah. This was super fun. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.